Welcome to the Data Democracy, presented by renowned O'Reilly author Ole Olesen-Bagneux, empowered by Xenia. Make your data accessible and discoverable by anyone, anywhere, at any time.
Hi everybody, you're listening to The Data Democracy, and I'm your host, Ole Olesen-Bagneux, Chief Evangelist in Xenia and author of the Enterprise Data Catalog published by O'Reilly. In this podcast, we explore what a data democracy is with knowledgeable guests. Today's guest is Pia Virmalainen. Pia is a director with Beauvais focusing on enterprise architecture, and that is what I wanted to ask Pia about. Pia has this unique view about data as biology. And furthermore, Pia is a long-time knowledge graph deep thinker. And so I obviously had to hear her out about that. First, a data leader takeaway. Shift verticals. If you don't stay in the same industry all of your career, you of course find yourself in a more difficult situation, but you come with unique perspectives and that can fuel true leadership. And second, a data democracy takeaway. Data can be inscribed in a national architecture, pushing for better civil service and also for innovation in the private sector. And third, a personal takeaway, never forget your inner geek. Pia has made a career out of it, waiting a decade before knowledge graphs took off and got popular. And now Pia is in the center of it all. Okay, enough of me talking. Let's hear what Pia has to say. Hi, Pia.
Hi, Ole.
I'm so happy to have you on. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
So, for the listeners, Pia, will you share a bit about what you've done in your work life, your career, your background, stuff like that?
Sure. I started off with having a master's in something called humanistic informatics, which is something I always need to explain to people, which is a more a perspective, a view on technology from the humanities perspective and social sciences perspective. How does technology influence us as individuals, our language, the way we communicate, but also how we're organized and how businesses work and how society is affected by technological development. And at the core of my studies at the university, I focused on data and how data was a key influence in this development. Which has followed me throughout my career. And I worked on semantic technologies and how we can create knowledge from data through graphs and information models and making representations of the real world in data. And I worked as a consultant for a few years within different sectors. Before I turned to industry, and I worked within quite complex value chains in Norway and in global industries in an enterprise architecture group. And then I turned to the public sector, where I worked with how data is a resource and a value for the public, but also how we can create national architecture that will support the use and the spread of data between public and private companies. So today I lead a department of brilliant advisors and enterprise architects and information architects that also work a lot on these same topics.
That sounds very interesting, and I will honestly say it does, because I have had pretty much the same career and educational track record in my own life. so I do understand why you're so interested in all of these things.
Yeah, and I think I think the more I've jumped from between different sectors, the more I recommend other people to do the same, because it really opens up people's eyes to things might look extremely obvious from one perspective, but when you pivot the view, it's not as obvious from a different perspective. And I think it's we live in such a complex world that it's impossible to think that you know the complete picture at all times. So that's the most fun experience I've drawn from changing different sectors, actually.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And on this, at the same time, you have these ambient problems, right? That they are all over the place, and they are very much the same all over the place. Legacy IT, data quality, what is a data product? Everyone trying to define that, right? Stuff like that. Okay, so obviously, I have also worked with enterprise architecture, so I know it. But not all listeners might know what enterprise architecture is. So, do you care just to a little bit explain what enterprise architecture is?
Well, there has been many attempts to explain what enterprise architecture is. So,
oh yes.
I believe you can, in a very, very simple way, say that it's a way of seeing organization, data, and processes as a whole, and understanding how technology can be used to support an organization's goals, in short. So it's about understanding the different connections and understanding what type of problems you should focus on that are core, and what type of problems that are more specialized in corner cases.
Yeah, that's a good way of framing it. Okay, so for the listeners, what's the stereotype of an enterprise architect?
Stereotype of an enterprise architect is that they sit in their own office somewhere, or in an ivory tower, which is a term often used, and they create a lot of PowerPoints or models, and they draw out boxes and arrows and speak a language that is hard for others to interpret and understand, and are often by, for example, people who work more in operations or in development. They might feel as if an enterprise architect comes in, tells the rules on how to do something, and then they leave.
Yeah, exactly. That's the stereotype. And I have, as an enterprise architect and as a leader engaging with enterprise architects, I have only seldom met that perspective, and I'm quite happy about that. Okay, but you also have a very unique approach to enterprise architecture, moving into the questions we prepared. I have been following you for a while, and you have this bodily perspective on enterprise architecture. So what is that about? It's like an organic, even like really like a bodily metaphor for enterprise architecture. So can you expand a bit on that?
Yeah. Well, I've like many others. I find it fascinating how you also refer to it as a unique perspective. I hope it's not a unique perspective. I hope more people that work with enterprise architecture actually have this in mind. But a lot of the comparisons, because of the word architect, are made to buildings. And also city planners, for example, that you work on. How should the streets be utilized? How can we reuse energy sources and so on when we build different types of buildings? And what kind of rooms do we need, and so on? What materials do we use? But the biggest difference between buildings and software is, of course, that we don't build software to last for 100 years like we do with buildings. And it's more difficult to foresee what kind of maintenance work you need. And so the house metaphor is, I find it a bit static. And therefore I feel like also in terms of the topic that we're going to talk about a bit later as well, with data mesh and moving from more centralized views on IT to a more distributed format, the architecture part of it is more like a bloodstream, something you need to live. It's something each body part has to have a connection to. It brings vital vitamins and minerals to the right parts of your body. It will help repair if you need to, or it will just be there and be at the core of why your hand works, and not be just. I think architects might feel like they are the heart.
Yeah.
But I think
or the brain.
yeah. But that's the business and the heart, the people, in the business.
Yeah, that is so true. Pia. Yeah. Well said.
But you need something that connects it all. I think the blood vessels, to me, is a good picture of that. That it connects the different parts, that what the left hand does and the right hand does, and kind of connecting them, knowing what each other does. So it's more a collaboration and connection than being at the very core of everything.
Yeah, that's a really, really good way of describing enterprise architecture. And at its best, right, enterprise architecture is not something an enterprise architect does. It's something that everyone does sometimes, once in a while, making decisions that make the IT landscape run more smoothly and logically altogether, right?
Yeah, and I think the important core of that is that you don't educate architects. So you don't kind of there's no school where you become an enterprise architect and then you're kind of perfect mold and then you just go out and do the job. It's lots and lots of experience, and it's often broad experience throughout the whole value chain, from procurement of software to operations to long-time governance and maintenance, to end of life, to understanding business and business goals, and doing transformations in an organization. So creating all these abilities in the organization, you have to have some actual experience with it to become an architect, to understand that there is a bigger perspective, that there are dilemmas that you will have, that there are ways to resolve opposite wishes in an organization. And it's, I think, yes, lots of people will have that kind of perspective during their careers, but then having it actually as a role in an organization is often undervalued as a formal role as well, and often placed too far down in the organization.
Yes. Yes, I've experienced all that, and think many enterprise architects have experienced that. And it's not a role, I mean, to just proceed in the conversation, it's not a role that you won't find an enormous team of enterprise architects in a company, right? It's a handful of people. That makes it also difficult, but also necessary to have as a team, right? It's difficult because you have to do an enormous amount of communication to a lot of people. You have to, I mean, what can go wrong with enterprise architecture, Pia?
What can go wrong?
Can you mention all the things that can go wrong?
Oh, there's so much can go
We
wrong.
don't. I don't think we have time. But
No,
but a few.
I think the most important parts, for my experience, is that that you have one person that's supposed to do everything. That's the number one mistake that's made. And also, if that person has lots of responsibilities, but they don't really have a mandate to do anything, then it's kind of a waste of that person's competence and time, I think.
Yeah.
And also, if it's too much focus on drawings and rules and really complicated technical specifications, then that is also a problem. You have to be there and solve real world needs for the organization. So yeah, just to mention a few.
Yeah. But you're right that like it can go wrong in so many ways. But we don't have to. I mean, I want to push forward in the conversation because we were always also discussing, preparing for this call. We were also discussing the role of the enterprise architect in data mesh, which makes it like it goes from hard to, I won't say impossible, but it's like it's an even bigger challenge to perform enterprise architecture in a data mesh, I dare say, because it's so federated, right? So how do you see the challenges for the enterprise architect in the mesh?
Well, it's, like I introduced with earlier on as well, it's a pendulum. So you go from centralized to more distributed or federated way of working. And I think for a time now, we've had very centralized view on enterprise architecture. And then some organizations have gone all the other way and said, like, we're completely distributed. We don't need an enterprise architecture at all. And that has also failed. We have examples of that where you start having autonomous teams that go too far in each direction, and it makes costs, for example, difficult to manage, and also results and gains. So it's an issue if the technical perspective gets to kind of state the direction that we're going in as well. So that's kind of the other the other way it can go wrong. So I think it's really important that enterprise architects understand that the role is changing, understand that they need to be more, to lean more in to the actual arguments that come from working more in product teams, working more autonomous, having the freedom to use the technology that is best suited to solve the tasks, and kind of respect that point of view as well. And I think it's an even less static role nowadays than before. You have to be even more organic. You have to be in the loop. You have to be in the discussion. You have to kind of see, where can I help? Where can I lift the conversations? Where can I provide guidelines? And kind of be the person that talks in between different parts of the organization and facilitate to a larger extent, enable the other teams that are working in a data mesh. I still, and I've met a lot of interesting discussions when I said I still believe enterprise architecture is really important. And I don't think that the business side yet is, in most organizations, mature enough to understand the technical implications of a lot of software and hardware that they buy and want to use. So you still need that kind of, translator role or facilitator, enabler. You can call it a lot of things, but you still need that kind of technical perspective on business, talking with a business.
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree. I think you cannot take enterprise architecture out of the equation. What you can do is and that happens a lot, you can fire all the enterprise architects in a company saying, we don't need this role anymore. But that doesn't mean that our enterprise architecture goes away. It just means that that more people are doing it in a more uncoordinated way, which typically results in the fact that you spend a little less money on salary for some admittedly very highly paid enterprise architects, but then the cost of your IT landscape just runs amok, right? It like the cost of it just tends to explode because all various parts of the business, the brain, the heart, the left hand, the right hand, buys their own technology, basically performing the same capabilities in various different cloud providers, all kind of programming languages, like.
Yes.
And it's not true that this should be forbidden, right? It's just that when there's no coordination, there's no real benefit of buying all this tech. So completely agreed. Okay, I ranted a little bit, but I've been in the I've been in the game. I've been in the game.
But I think most important is that it's also, enterprise architecture is, of course, you need to have a solid technology understanding, but it's also about competence. One organization can't possibly hold all types of technology competence.
Of course
just
not.
because one person wants to use this and another person wants to use that. And I really
it's
understand.
Basic mathematics, right?
It's basic
There's
mathematics.
more tech than people. Yeah. Agreed.
So, and I also, Conway's law, you produce the products that will mirror the way you're organized, right? And if you're organized quite dispersed, then it might be a bit more difficult to control the business outcomes that you really want. And so you need to have some sort of principles or guidelines or understandings of, we need to do this because this is the business outcome we want. This is the need we need to find a solution to. And that requires coordination between different efforts.
Yeah, totally. So you mentioned the pendulum at least once, perhaps a couple of times, going from centralized to decentralized and back again. What kind of role would an enterprise? Okay, this is very hypothetical. I don't know if you've seen it yet, but there are organizations out there that start data mesh implementations and then realize, okay, this is totally not for us. And those organizations are typically organizations not looking to expand their value chain in any way. I mean, you can be a perfectly well-functioning company with relevant, stable products and not want to expand that portfolio, and that's okay. Then you probably don't need a data mesh, right? But certain companies have just implemented the mesh, trying to create data products that are consumable, but then they realize this is not for us. This is a long question, but can you elaborate a little bit on what would the enterprise architect do in such a situation?
That is a difficult question, because I think I've had some of the value of having an enterprise architect is having someone who knows the business, understanding how you can design a direction to help the business achieve its goals. And that is it depends on a lot of the different capabilities that you have or don't have in an organization. So what you would do depends on what kind of maturity would you have within the competence side to it. So if you have a gap in competence, then that's a good place to start. If you have a gap in where you have different kind of cloud vendors and on-prem solutions and lots of different technologies in your portfolio, that's a good place to start. So you need to understand these kind of deep business core capabilities to understand where to begin. And I think that is actually where an enterprise architect provides value. You could nest starting solving the problem in the right corner. It's very general. It's a very generic answer, but it is.
To a very generic question also, right? Because I guess there's a lot of different reasons why people would want to get off the mesh, right? And it could be, as you say, a lack of competencies. It could be simply a strategic desire that was not met by the responsibility it takes for the various business. I mean, there can be a ton of reasons why people would want to go away from a data mesh implementation again.
Yeah, right? And I think a lot of the anchoring of the initiative, was it business who wanted to do data mesh, or was it IT that wanted to do data mesh? It's a big difference. Because you can easily get caught up in a blame game as well if costs escalate and if things are not delivered as promised, or so.
And that is when you kill the enterprise architect, right? That is when you fire them.
Yes, there's lots and lots of politics in this. Absolutely,
yeah. So enterprise, for listeners that don't know the roles of enterprise architects, enterprise architects tend to get fired because they have high salaries in the very moments when they are needed the most. But that is just the paradox of this kind of job. Okay, but so on that note, on the political note, I also prepared a question because you have experience from the public sector, as you mentioned in the beginning, and that is really interesting in terms of enterprise architecture, because political organizations, they work in a different way, I dare say, than companies that have profit motives. So how do you perform enterprise architecture in a political organization?
That's an interesting question. I think we have, for example, in Norway, you have a lot of these common components. So identity management, but also lots of different registries. You have different kind of reference architectures, patterns. How do you exchange data between organizations and so on? And you have to. There is a political will to that most public sector organizations use these common components as much as possible. So that kind of frames the enterprise architecture a lot. So it's about using these common components, which is the best for the public sector, which saves money because someone is doing actually some governance work on these different components, and so on. I think it depends a lot if whether you're a central government or local government. I think in local government, you don't have lots of IT resources. In Norway, you have municipalities that are really small. So you're absolutely codependent on vendors and products from the market. In those terms, it can be difficult to do enterprise architecture for the reason that the buying capabilities are spread out in the different sectors. And it's, you don't have much market power. You can't really say that we demand that you will deliver this and this to us in this format, for example, because unless 200 other municipalities have the same requirements, the product won't change. So you have less that kind of power to customize stuff.
Yeah.
So it's a different type of being enterprise architect. It's more like having Lego bricks, and you just kind of need them to fit together as best as you can, and you will have some extras somewhere. So it's a less customizable work.
Yeah. That sounds very reasonable.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that actually concludes our talk. Thank you, Pia, so much for coming on the show. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was interesting.